If you feel misunderstood, it could be because you're never sharing yourself. And if you're not understanding your own feelings and your own needs, then how can you convey them to somebody else? And because dismissive avoidants are often repressing and stuffing down, they're out of touch with themselves, and then they can't convey information to other people around them.
GAs obviously are very independent, and they've been independent for a very, very long time. So any sort of encroachment on that, if somebody's trying to take away their independence or autonomy, we will fight to the death to retain that.
Her name is Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
Thais Gibson.
I hope I pronounce her name properly. Thais Gibson.
I am so excited for you to be here with me today. Thank you for joining us. Hello, and welcome back to another episode of our podcast at the Personal Development School. My name is Thais, and this is our amazing co-host, Mike DiZio. And today I have a really special treat for you. And I think this will be a really fun episode. Today, we are going to break down the things that will cause a dismissive avoidant in relationships to run. The big triggers, the fears, the wounds. I'm going to start by breaking down this high-level overview of these things. And then if you've been following this podcast for a little while, you know that I used to be a fearful avoidant attachment style. Mike used to be a dismissive avoidant attachment style, and we've both done the work to become secure. So where the special treat comes in here today is I'm going to start by just overviewing the different major triggers and fears of the dismissive avoidant. And then Mike is actually going to explain, having once been a dismissive avoidant himself, what it feels like and the reasons these things are triggering. And my hope is that for you listening, if you're somebody who either is a dismissive avoidant and wants to better understand yourself, or for probably the vast majority of the audience here listening today, maybe has a loved one, friend, somebody you're dating, an ex, who is a dismissive avoidant, it's going to help you realize, okay, this is their inner world and the things that they are going through, and it's actually not so personal. And it can help you actually depersonalize some of their behavior through understanding and insight. And you'll also learn a little bit more about what to do and how to respond to some of these things as a whole. So we're going to dive in pretty quick here, and we'll start by just going through the fact that there are behaviors that will cause dismissive avoidance to run. And there are about 8 or 9 major ones that we're going to unpack. So the very first one is if they feel like their need for alone time and space is disrespected or infringed upon. Okay. And again, we're going to unpack all of the reasons why, what's going on in their inner world. The second one is if there's an excessive need for communication, especially if there's pressure around it in some sort of way. And if there's a sense of dependency or clinginess in a relationship. Of course, you know that can cause a dismissive avoidant to feel enmeshed or overwhelmed, trapped, engulfed, and then that can be something that they will really run and sort of run head for the hills around. Other big things, and these really relate to some of their core wounds that, remember, come from childhood, are things like if somebody's making assumptions on how they are feeling. This is something that really causes a dismissive avoidant to shut down because they have a big I am misunderstood core wound that can deeply affect them. And of course, some of the other obvious ones, things like if they feel controlled in a relationship too much, if they feel like there's too much of a demand for vulnerability, all of those things will often trigger the core wounds that they have. Things like I am trapped, helpless, powerless, I'm weak if I'm too vulnerable. And then if there is conflict in a relationship. It's funny because a lot of, especially fearful avoidant attachment styles, sometimes their subconscious comfort zone in a relationship is to have conflict. And for a lot of dismissive avoidants, it will be something that erodes the relationship faster than almost anything, and it can trigger their core wound of feeling like they are unsafe. And then, of course, as most of you know, if they feel criticized and rejected by that criticism, they have big core wounds around feeling defective, which often comes from emotional neglect in childhood. And that will again cause them to shut down, feel like they need to go into self-preservation or self-protection mode and really move the relationship in the opposite direction. So with that high-level overview really covered, what I want to dive into is, sharing and Mike being able to share from a personal space the intimate relationship he had to feeling those things at one point in time, so that you can really see from the inside of the dismissive avoidance world what that is all about. So I want to start with the idea that, a dismissive avoidant often feels triggered if their alone time or space are disrespected, if that need is disrespected in some way or judged or criticized. So what can you give some examples of when you were ever in a relationship where you felt like that and really like what that experience felt like to you from the inside?
Yeah, so I love that we're doing this episode as well, because I hope that partners of an avoidant or partners of a dismissive avoidant can hear some of these things and sort of understand more of the inner workings of it and realize that like it's not personal. It's more of a thing on our end that we're sort of needing to take space for. So anyway, happy to talk about this. And the first one we'll dive into was, yeah, if somebody's encroaching, infringing on your taking space, or making you feel bad for it, or just straight up trying to like take your space and just won't go away, but like is really trying to spend more time than you want to spend with them. So I'll give us an example of a story. Like, I had a girlfriend once and she would always want to hang out on weekends. So it's kind of our thing to hang out on the weekends because that's when we were mostly available. And for me, like, sleeping over was okay, it was fine, but I only wanted to do that for one of the nights. I felt if there was 2 nights, I'd be basically with this person the whole weekend, and I wouldn't have time sort of to myself to sort of recharge, replenish, get back to my baseline, and then go back into work on Monday sort of feeling refreshed. So there was always arguments, her getting upset saying like, "Why can't you sleep over Friday and Saturday night?" And I'm like, "Listen, like, it's not that I don't wanna spend time with you, it's that, like, I need, like, I need at least one night of sleep to, like, be by myself, be in my own bed, have my own space, and just wake up, like, alone and do the things I need to do, and then I can come back and I'm happy to hang out."
Was
So for
she
me,
was she a fearful avoidant?
I think she was more like, fearfully leading anxious. Yeah.
Uh, it's so interesting too, because like, I just for anybody who's listening to this, like, as a fearful avoidant, like, if that before I did the work to become secure,
Yeah.
if I was dating somebody and that's what happened, for sure, I would just be suspicious. I would be like, "Oh, they have another girlfriend or something,"
Yeah. Yeah.
because there's, like, that lack of trust, and I think when you're more anxious leaning, either as an FA with the anxious side to your attachment style or as an anxious attachment style, you often, when you're anxious leaning, you're, like, in a position where you feel like, "Oh, when I care about somebody, I would wanna spend so much time with them." So, if
Yeah.
somebody doesn't wanna spend time with me, they either don't care about me or something more is going on. So, it's just so interesting to hear that, and for you, that was your truth. Like, I can't I need to re-regulate and come back to myself.
It's like literally like I physically can't. Like if I do, there's gonna be a penalty to it. Like I'm gonna feel terrible Monday morning. I'm gonna feel like I didn't get to have that refresh time. And I'm basically gonna feel like I didn't have at least some time to feel better. So, you could trade that off and then spend time with your person and then they're happy. But at what cost is that? Like if you're not feeling good, then you're not doing anybody any good. So and I would kinda, like, little get upset as well at the time because I was like, "Why why are you trying to take so much? Like, you're having me for all day Saturday during the day, sleepover, and then pretty much almost all day Sunday. So what's one night, like, together gonna do? Like, why can't we just have that one night off?" But she was really, like, adamant, like, she just wanted to spend the whole weekend together. So
And so what did you feel internally? Like, did you feel misunderstood? Did you feel hurt? Did you just feel like I need to protect and sort of push away? Like, what was your experience there?
yeah, yeah, exactly. I sort of felt like at first I was a little bit like irritated and annoyed, like, why can't she see this point of view? But if you're not in my shoes, like if you don't have that need for rest and recovery by yourself, if you never had that experience in your life, of course, it's really going to be hard to like understand, hey, is this person like telling the truth? Like, or do they just really like, not want to be with me? So part of me understands that, someone who's more anxious really has that need and just really, really wants to spend the whole weekend together. But having not been an avoidant, they also are like, this is what people do. Like, why wouldn't you want to spend all weekend with me?
Yeah.
So, and yeah, just to go back to what you said, it would start out with a little bit of frustration because I'm like, and we'll talk about being misunderstood later in the episode, but I would feel misunderstood. And then, I would sort of, because DAs are actually pretty good with like survival boundaries, I was pretty like gangster with her.
Sharp.
No. Yeah, I'm like,
Yeah.
no, like I'm not sleeping over Friday. Like I'll come over early Saturday, but I have to sleep in my bed on Friday night. And then inevitably I'd get off the phone and then I'd feel a little crummy. I'd be like, oh, like she sounded really disappointed or upset. And then I had a little bit of guilt. But I would like there's for sure I was gonna go back and be like, okay, I'm sleeping over.
You're not compromising.
Yeah. So all in all, as I talk about this, it's kind of frustrating because you feel misunderstood and you feel like your needs are not being sort of honored and the person's not understanding your sort of physiology, basically.
Yeah. And I think something that's interesting for listeners is like we all tend to project from our perception. So we all tend to, if you're fearful, avoidant, leaning anxious, or you're an anxious attachment style, you're sitting there going, I would want to spend all this time with somebody that I care about. And so and it's not that it's like consciously evaluated. It's this like subconscious belief system. And so this idea that in your spare time you could ever want to do something else only leads somebody who's anxious or fearful avoidant usually to one of two conclusions, which is either you don't care and you're not really wanting to show up and you're probably not invested in this long term, or you are in a position where like literally you have a second life. Like you you cannot be trusted. What's going on?
Yeah.
And and it's sad because it's like that's just your honest to goodness truth in that situation. You're going through this internal struggle at the time of like, I am struggling to co-regulate and I need that space and time to myself. I don't know how to be around somebody for that long without being drained. And I'm just
Mhm.
trying to survive and feel okay for the work week. But like for somebody else, it's probably just bringing up all of their core wounds. And so that's why it's so important to like, for people to hear this and learn about this stuff so they can realize, hey, there's more to these things that are taking place.
Yeah, exactly. No, that's such a good point. And just that whole thing about attachment theory in general, like it's like playing the board game and having a different set of rules. So, when I explain my set of rules and they're not understanding, it gets a little frustrating. Um, but again, I wish I could do that. Like I really wish I could have. Now that I know like I can do it now and like okay, the honest truth, I need to be in like a big bed to sleep with someone. Like I think this is a DA thing as well, but like a little more spatially aware. Like we need a little more space with a lot of things, but especially with like sleeping. Like you
Yeah.
need like a king size bed. So that was another thing too. Like if any listeners can relate, any DAs can relate, like sleepovers are fun, I used to love sleepovers, especially when I was a kid. But I need to have like a good amount of space during the sleep. So some people want to like hold each other and like be touching all night. I'm fine with, a good cuddle before we go to sleep. But then when it's sleep time, I kind of need to be on my side of the bed. So that's
I think
another.
that could also be like to be like just completely honest. I also know other people. Like I like my space when I sleep as well. Like when I'm sleeping, so I'm a restless sleeper and I'm a light sleeper sometimes. So and I move around a lot. So I feel like that's also that can be. And I know lots of people. I know lots of anxious people who are restless sleepers and light sleepers, and they if their partner snores, it really stresses them out, or things like that. So I do think it could also be because you've said to me before, like, oh, you're such a light sleeper. So it could be that as well as like a part of it in
Yeah.
current times, but it's like you're absolutely right that dismissive avoidants generally are a lot more like spatially aware for sure. And I think that's around like their personal space too and their privacy and like so many things that we'll get into. So I think
Yeah.
that's an awesome place to start. So let's dive into the next one. There's so much to get through. So the next thing is if somebody has this sort of excessive need for communication, and I want to sort of pair that with our one afterwards, which is a clinginess. So we can sort of put those two together. And often what you'll see is if that can be something that overwhelms or stresses out a dismissive avoidant, when I would work with a lot of dismissive avoidant clients, you could see that they would feel almost like a sense of panic around that and really stress, and it could cause them to deeply shut down. And I would love for you to just unpack a little bit about what that panic and that feeling is and where it's really coming from. Because I think that if you're on the outside of it, people are like, oh, they just don't care. They don't want to invest. They're not interested. And there's really a lot more to that story.
Yeah. For myself, I know that like just during the day, like if I'm focused on other things, like it would probably be the job. Like most of the time I had 40-hour work week jobs Monday to Friday. And if somebody's trying to like leave me voice notes or like message or whatever, I'm probably like busy at work and a little bit stressed that it's almost like an annoyance where you're getting messages from the person and they're just saying things that are not really super important. You know what I mean? Like if it's a message saying like, hey, can you bring home whatever so and so for dinner? Then cool. But like if somebody just wants to share a story of, I don't know, someone that they ran into today and the conversation that they had or whatever, For me, it just seemed to be more of like a bother. Like, why are you sort of burdening this with me right now? Like,
And why? And can you share why? Just so people also listening aren't like, "Oh my gosh, I'm just my partner just thinks I'm a bother." Like, can you understand can you explain some of that context? Like, why? Is it because you're already feeling overwhelmed and now you feel like there's more pressure and you have this trapped core wound and you feel engulfed? Like, tell us a little bit about that part.
for me, it was more I was already feeling overwhelmed. I sort of always had that little low anxiety going on, and I'm just during the day sort of trying to keep my head above water.
Mhm.
When I'm free and clear, then talk to me as much as you want and let's spend time together or whatnot. But it was mostly like during the day, I would feel like a little overwhelmed with the tasks that I have at work and whatnot, that anything sort of put on top of that seemed like an extra obligation or an extra like energy give. So it would just be like, and the poor person just wants to connect and reach out and see how you're doing. But if they catch you at the wrong time, you're just kind of like, oh, like, please leave me alone. Like, why are you bothering me right now?
And would that make you when that happened, would that make you question your feelings about that person, or would that make you feel like you were just coming from this place of overwhelm, you care about the person, but you're just feeling like, "Oh my gosh, I can't handle everything right now."
Yeah. Uh, I, I'm sure I'd have a conversation and just let them know, like, hey, like, not a good time. Like 3 words on their response and just like give a very blunt answer, like, I can't answer you right now or not a good time. And just sort of try to explain to them. Then when I did have time, just say, hey, listen, like during the day, I'm like pretty focused on work. So like unless it's something super important or something that needs attention urgently, like definitely call me or reach out. But like I don't I wouldn't really want to engage in like little small talk chit chat during the day, that's for sure.
I just want to jump in here and let you know that we are doing a 14-day free trial to the All Access Membership Pass at PDS, which means you get access to literally everything inside of the school. And this includes the 4 live webinars I do with our students every single week. And on top of that, you get access to all of our different courses. We have over 55 different courses on relationships, communication, boundaries, emotional mastery, guilt and shame, learning your needs, so many different facets that are really important to master our lives and feel really good about our lives going forward. And last but not least, there's a daily community event. We have trained facilitators and coaches who are in there doing that work, showing up to support you on your journey every single day. Please join me on the other side. Come check it out. See if it's a fit for you. I'd love to see you there. Go ahead and sign up by clicking the link in the description box below. Okay, so for anybody listening too, that's something where, because I feel like a lot of people listening, if they are dating an avoidant or have an avoidant ex, I don't want people to be like, "Oh my gosh, I'm annoying to people," or it's remember, it's actually coming from at its core is the fact that like dismissive avoidants carry this low level anxiety a lot of the time, and it's because you grew up and you weren't properly attuned to, and you didn't get your needs met in childhood. Then what happens is you end up feeling like there's just this low level anxiety, and everything can make you feel so much more sensitive to being trapped or overwhelmed or panicked. And there's this fear of like, okay, any other pressure added to my plate, because dismissive avoidants are just trying to kind of stay regulated as much as they can, let alone be able to help co-regulate with somebody else, which is such an important part. If anybody follows this channel, that they know is something we talk about, the importance of co-regulation when a dismissive avoidant is healing. And so remember, like if you are hearing this, it's not that you are annoying or you are bad. It's that this person is receiving added external stimulation as something that causes that I am trapped core wound to be there, or even I am unsafe. If somebody's feeling like emotionally like they can't handle things, there can be this low level feeling of unsafety that honestly is just the result of a dysregulated nervous system being in fight or flight too easily. And so then this person is having that experience, and sure, outside of work or when things are normal, or if the person's not working full time or has more spare time, that's less likely to be there. But that should be a conversation you have with your partner about boundaries and expectations. And B, it should also be something where you encourage them to work on that, because you should also feel like, and without going too far off topic, just, it's healthy to have text exchanges throughout the day. All day, every day, we usually move right into codependency. But a text exchange in the morning, maybe a hello at lunchtime, a phone call perhaps in the evening, if you're in a more serious committed relationship with somebody, those are normal exchanges. So if it's all day, every day, then we could make an argument that, hey, that could actually be a little bit too much. But there's this healthy middle ground there. And if you're dating somebody who's struggling to get there, that's definitely a conversation worth having.
Yeah, exactly. And on my end, I know I wasn't great with like how they don't know what's going on my end. They don't know maybe that day was particularly busy and I had like back to back meetings or something like that. And again, I would just get frustrated because it was sort of the nervous system being really like overwhelmed. It's just because they put like the final straw that broke the camel's back, but they didn't know that, right? So it's up to me to tell them, hey, today's like super busy with me at work. You probably won't hear from me until tonight. So just thinking about you. We'll catch up when I get home. So again, it was more the misunderstood core wound. Instead of like explicitly explaining this process and like how sometimes work gets out of control, it was more me expecting them like to just know magically like, hey, this is a terrible time that you're sending me a message like
You
please.
should know to never text me during, yeah. And also, I think there's an important point where it's up to the person to learn to regulate their nervous system so that a text doesn't have the capacity to cause them to feel like, which is something I know you obviously worked on now. But, for anybody listening, I think it's important as well that person, if you're doing the work and you're listening to this podcast and you're dating somebody who's DA, if you are a DA listening to this, you're probably doing the work in some capacity. Otherwise, you wouldn't be here. But if you're the partner of one or loved one of one, that's an important thing to encourage for them and to kind of vet for, honestly.
For sure. And last comment I'll add is just don't check your phone every 20 minutes. If you're that busy, like put your phone away and say, okay, I'm going to dedicate this next 2-3 hours to my job and just be present. Then you won't get disturbed. Right. So
Totally. Yeah.
there's definitely, I just want everyone to know, like there's a million things that someone like myself could have done on my end to make those situations easier and better.
Yeah.
But yeah, just for the sake of today's episodes, DAs can get kind of overwhelmed or out of sorts if there's too much communication. Yeah.
I love that. Okay, so that was amazing, and that was such a good unpacking of something that you'll just see all the time. And then what about assumptions of how they're feeling? So I used to say I've said this a lot to dismissive avoidants in our school, people who come in and because there are a good bit of dismissive avoidants who like actually show up to do the work, but um, I've often said, and I would say this when I was in client practice too, I would say, listen, if you feel misunderstood, it could be because you're never sharing yourself. And and if you're not understanding your own feelings and your own needs, then how can you convey them to somebody else? And because dismissive avoidants are often repressing and stuffing down, they're out of touch with themselves. And then they can't convey information to other people around them. And then instead it often comes out as this like, you should just know me. You kind of said it yourself a second ago. Like you should just understand me. Like you should know not to text me at work. You should know, these things. And so
Yeah.
I think this really unpacks, and I'm curious to hear your experiences around when dismissive avoidance would, or when you were a dismissive avoidant, how that like misunderstanding core wound would show up and what your relationship was to it.
Yeah, just the thing that pops most in my head is my poor mom. Like I would get really frustrated and kind of like snap on my mom a little bit when I was younger because she would make assumptions about things or be like, "Oh, it seems to me you're feeling this way." And I'm like, "No, I don't feel that at all." Like, and I would get really snarky and like mean about it. And ma'am, I know, honest to God, like I've apologized to my mom many times about
I think it's, I can just see you being like, no, that it's not actually what I'm feeling at all.
yeah, not even close. But the thing is too, like DAs, we're not really emotionally expressive. So it's not obvious about how someone's feeling, like reading their facial expressions or tone of voice even and stuff like that. So there's a lot of guesswork involved sometimes when you're dealing with a DA. Like, I'm sure a lot of people can attest to this, like dating a DA. Sometimes you don't know where you stand. You're like, does this person like me or are they into me or not? Like, it seems like they might be, but might not be. Like, it's just not obvious. And then for APs, that like they can make it pretty darn obvious, really early on, right? Which is super cute. But yeah, just to go back to the mom thing, like she would tell me too, like, well, you don't tell me like what's going on in your life, or you don't tell me what's happening. Like, I wouldn't share with her any intimate details, who I'm dating or who my friends were. Like basically everything was sort of a big secret. So she was just left to try to put the pieces together as best as she could.
For our listeners, did you know that you were being quote unquote secretive when you were doing that? Because it's interesting. Like, I think the word secret, we think of somebody intentionally being secretive and intentionally trying to hide. But what I found so often with dismissive avoidance, at least when I was working in client practice, is that they wouldn't realize, at least, like I'd have conversations. Oh, did you say this with your partner? Or did you intentionally hide it? Or did you? And almost always, they didn't even like, it wasn't like they were intending to be secretive or hide things. It was just, like, so unnatural for them to share their inner worlds with other people a lot, and I'm curious, like, how your relationship was there.
Yeah, no, like sharing, being very expressive and sharing the inner world just felt so foreign, and it wasn't something.
Yeah, so it wasn't like you were, like, trying to hide things. It was just, like, you just didn't feel
No.
it that way.
Yeah, exactly. And I just felt like so much information is kind of like was useless,
Unnecessary? Yeah.
unnecessary, almost like a waste of words. Like I'm not going to waste words because some people have conversations and they can make like a 1 minute story last like half an hour. They're telling you the direction of the wind that day and the colors and like everything, right? But myself and maybe DAs are a little more succinct and don't really use a lot of filler because probably during the experiences that they're having, there's not a lot of like rich emotional feelings happening during it.
Yeah.
So it's very factual. Like I went to school today and it was good. And there's not much like rich detail what's going on. So I honestly think in the to save energy was just to like give the most basic info.
Yeah.
And then also, but then I would find out after like people want to know the stuff that I consider boring. Like when they're like, tell me a little more, like expand on that. Like, what did it feel like when you were at school today? Like when you did that project. And then I would share and they'd be like, that's really cool. That's super interesting. And I was like, oh, okay. Like people
Surprise.
you like to hear a little more information about me.
And I think for people, like, in the life of a dismissive avoidant, it's because you care about that person and, like, hearing about their lives and inner world is like a subconscious strategy for connection. You feel connected to somebody when they're sharing their inner world. Or I know I used to work with so many people who would be in long distance relationships, and one of the first things that we would work on if they were struggling in a long distance relationship would be to practice closing the physical gap with, like, being more emotionally vulnerable. And one of the easiest ways to do that is to intentionally share small details about your day, because somebody lives on the other side of the world and then you're sharing just high level things, they feel so disconnected from your life. But if somebody's sharing, oh yeah, I had this talk with my boss today and it went like this and this is how I experienced it, and the more you can actually do that, the more people feel like they're close emotionally because they're in on each other's lives on a daily basis. And so it's just so interesting that, for people listening, that as a dismissive avoidant, your natural tendency is to not do that, and you can see how that would create this emotional gap as well.
Yeah, exactly. Even like before, I always thought I was super abnormal because it seemed like people phone their parents quite often and talk to their siblings often, and it was a lot of communication. And I was fine with talking to my parents like once a month, like just basically fitting a month's worth of information into like a 20-minute phone call, and that was good enough. But if you think about it, at the end of the day, if you're, let's say, in a new relationship or you're trying to grow it and become more connected with the person, you're going to want to like share more than once a month with that person, right?
Absolutely.
And then you're going to want to share more sort of, yeah, details in your life because, there's only a certain amount of topics you can talk about. So you got to sort of expand, what you've done through the day and, just let person in on your reality. And I know it helps breed like closeness and stuff like that.
And to the point of, like, this one, and we'll go into the next one here, but to the point of this is, like, it helps so much to be understood. And
Yeah.
that was something I even learned and worked on as a fearful avoidant, less so in general, because I would definitely be, like, more expressive and communicative about my day or share things. But, the things that I felt vulnerable around, like if somebody hurt me in a relationship or something was affecting me, I would always shy away from those types of conversations. And then, I would internalize it and stuff that down, and it would come out in a different way. And then over time, it was so healing for me to realize, like, oh, if something hurts me or affects me, I just have to share about it. I have to say, hey, this didn't feel good. This is a boundary. Or hey, this a need wasn't met here that's actually super important to me. And that was such a big part of, like, healing and becoming more secure, was when I shared those small details. It was like, oh, people actually understand the way that I work and the things that I like and don't like and what my boundaries are, and people naturally respect them more. Whereas before I was like, oh, people don't care if you have boundaries, but that was just my assumption because I was never setting them. So I always
Right.
felt like they were violated. So anyways, it's such an important piece for anybody with an avoidance side there.
Definitely.
So I want to go into the next piece. This is such a big one, and it's this concept of feeling controlled by a partner. So obviously, if a dismissive avoidant is feeling controlled in a relationship dynamic, that can be extremely triggering. Do you have an experience you want to share about maybe when that happened with you and what that felt like internally?
Um, I'll try to think of a specific one in a moment, but just high overview, like being controlled, like GAs obviously are very independent and they've been independent for a very, very long time. So any sort of encroachment on that, if somebody's trying to like take away their independence or autonomy, it's like really like we will fight to the death to retain that.
And that's something that made them feel safe in childhood. So if a child grows up in a household where they're emotionally neglected and they can't get their needs met and that we're wired as children for attunement and for exchange from our caregivers. And if your emotional needs are not being met, your needs
Yeah.
for the ability for a caregiver to be present and attuned are not being met, eventually a
Mhm.
child literally learns to like create space and distance from the caregiver because they feel,
Mhm.
like they're not having their needs met. And that actually creates relief. Instead of expecting and yearning for something that constantly feels like it's getting rejected, let me just become hyper independent. And then at least I stop feeling this ongoing sense of neglect that's happening on a regular basis. And so it's almost
Yeah.
like it's not just, hey, you've been independent for a long time and here it is, we're going to now encroach on that. It's that independence is also something that gave dismissive avoidance relief growing up. It was where they felt safe and like they had some sort of control. And so somebody taking away from that is like you're taking away from not just a need that I had, but also something that deeply helped me cope for a really long time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that makes so much sense. And it might be small things like somebody saying, "Oh, you're on your phone too much," or "Oh, we should be. I want to have a phone call every night for an hour." But for me, I'm like, at the time, I was like, "There's no way. Like, I'm not gonna talk for an hour every single every single night." And yeah, it would be kind of like blunt and a little rude about it. Like, we always talk about a good relationship is where you have like a negotiation about it. Somebody can come to you and say, "Hey, I've been feeling a little disconnected lately. So wondering if maybe we could talk at least once in the evening for, 30 minutes." And then if I was, a little more secure at the time, I would have been like, okay, maybe 30 minutes is a little long. How about we just check in for like 10 minutes and then on the weekend we can have hour long conversations
Yeah.
just because I have more space and more energy and whatnot. But no, at the time I would feel like they're trying to tell me what to do. Probably just reminded me of my parents sort of telling me what to do. And I was just like, no, like that's not happening. We can, so
And
it's
I think that
it's
the
immature. It sounds immature as I say it, but like again, just a DA when they feel they're either being controlled or going to be forced to do more than they want to do, like give more than they want to give, they're going to have a kind of a bad reaction to it and put up like a bit of a wall. It can be a little harsh. Yeah.
totally and it's funny because the root of this, in my opinion, or let's not call it the root, because the root is the neglect and the independence, but it's almost like the secondary way out at the root, is that I would say this is dismissive avoidant clients all the time. I would be like, is this a solvable problem?
Mm.
And is it solvable through communication? And then a lot of dismissal ones would be like, yeah, it is. And I'd be like, okay, and have you communicated? And almost always when I would start working with dismissive avoidant clients, they'd be like, no, I haven't. And it's so interesting because you wouldn't feel controlled if you felt like you had the control to speak. And so if you're able to, in that situation, when somebody's going, I know you know this, but for our listeners, right? If you're able to, as a dismissive avoidant, in a situation where somebody's like making a request, okay, I'd like to speak for an hour every evening. And if that request feels overwhelming, the reason it also feels controlling is that it's like a lot of dismissive avoidants don't know how to negotiate needs or communicate
Yeah.
needs. And so there's this sense of like, oh, it's all or nothing. This person's making me do this. And it's like, wait, no one's making you do anything. You have the autonomy to actually say, hey, I'm not available for an hour every night. Can we do half an hour every other night? Or can we do this instead? And here's why, and here's my stance. And if a dismissive avoidant fully empowers the ability to communicate openly in their lives, so much of the feeling of being out of control goes away. Because
Yeah.
and it's interesting too, I would have dismissive avoidant clients sometimes, and they would be like, oh, relationships and emotions. I would hear this a lot in various ways from DAs. Relationships and emotions are, they're not logical, they're not rational, they're not solvable. And I would always be like, wait, no, you can have a totally rational, logical approach to relationships. You can sit down and just because somebody has a different need than you, it doesn't mean that it's all or nothing. And it's an incompatibility. It means you have to have the sense of self-control that I can communicate. And I think that in a shadow way, whenever we don't know how to control our dialogue or our communication or our boundaries because we don't know how to convey them to other people, it feels like everybody's trying to control you because it feels like people make requests and it has to be a yes rather than and then instead dismissive ones usually rebel and they're like, no, but it's just a no. I'm just gonna run in the opposite direction. But almost always in relationships, there's a gray area. Almost always there's a way to like find that communication of needs. But what happens is if you never grew up seeing that, you didn't have that model to you, then how could you ever know that? It's like an unknown unknown to dismissive avoidance. And so everything feels controlling, even if that's not the other person's relationship to it at all.
Exactly. Like right away, you almost feel like it's like the person's coming to you with an all or nothing demand. And so automatically you just like, no, like not happening. Like, leave me alone. And I really think like the DAs need to understand like they have needs and they shouldn't be ashamed of having these needs and expressing these needs. So like I know for me there was a lot of shame. Like I wish I could talk on the phone for 2 hours with my partner. I wish I could, spend a week straight with my partner. But the fact is like I just don't have the bandwidth for it. But there's so much shame around that because I'm already thinking like, man, like I'm defective. There's something wrong with me. I don't know how to do relationships. I feel like a bit of a fail here. Like I sort of would always put it on me that, they're the way they're wanting the relationship to be is probably the way that relationships are. And I'm sort of the one who's like causing problems. But no, like your needs are your needs. And if you do need a little more time to yourself to feel optimal, then you need to like own that and communicate it. But having said that, you should also be a little flexible because sometimes we can be very like rigid and be like, okay, I need 7.5 hours of sleep every night. And if my partner wants to stay up half an hour later to finish the movie, no, we can't do that. Like I won't feel perfect the next day. Like you should be a little flexible on things like that, but don't sort of back down or don't like be ashamed of expressing what it is that you need that makes you feel the best. Because at the end of the day, if you feel really good and great, then the time that you can spend with the person, it's so much more quality than quantity. But imagine you overextended yourself just to please your partner, and then you're spending time with them the next day, and you're tired, and you're just feeling mopey, and like you don't really want to talk to them. You probably resent them a little bit. Like there's going to be a buildup. I guess has more FA, but there just will be.
In parts of that, even you can still have resentment and just internalize it as a DA, right? And at FA, it comes out more, but and there's sort of a balance here, right? Which is because you're raising some really important points, which is there's times, and I would say this to dismiss avoiding clients, like, is it a non-negotiable or is there room for a little bit of healthy compromise? And check in with your compromise. Is that a compromise that grows you and it pushes you slightly outside of your comfort zone, or is this a compromise that's detrimental? And I think, like, really, as a dismiss avoidant, being able to weigh those things, because if somebody, has a 4-hour presentation to give in the work meeting tomorrow morning, and it's the most important presentation with a potential promotion at the end of it for their life, no, get your 7.5 hours of sleep. You wanna be fresh, right? And that compromise could be detrimental. You're taking away from yourself. But if it's like, "Hey, you've actually slept great all week. You think you need that 7.5 hours," but your partner's like, "Hey, let's just stay up another 15, 20 minutes to finish the movie." Hey, that actually might be a healthy compromise in the situation to push me a little out of my comfort zone to be able to work with somebody else in this relationship dynamic. And often weighing that clearly and taking the time to do it allows a dismissive avoidant to know their needs, but also to be in a place where they have this healthy amount of growth in a relationship, and healthy amount of like, hey, sometimes, and you always say this, and I love this. is how meaningful it is to, as a dismissive avoidant in healing, how meaningful it is to make what was outside of your comfort zone comfortable through just practicing
Yeah.
it. And a lot of times, maybe not around sleep and things like that per se, but around things like, meeting somebody's family or going on a trip or trying something new or communicating in a more vulnerable way. Sometimes those things, they feel like a compromise, but they're actually growth. And
Yeah.
so we have to be able to weigh those differences. And that's a practice for dismissive avoidance in their healing journey. It's something they have to like check in with and rationally explore. But the more you're able to, the easier of a time you'll have feeling like, hey, I can show up for me and in a relationship. It doesn't have to be mutually exclusive.
Exactly. I love that. I love that sort of how you said, look at it as like, is this something that I'm just being super rigid on? Or is this something that if I do, it might actually help me sort of create a new comfort zone, help me grow in essence. So I think for the DA, they have to step out of their comfort zone a little more because APs and FAs are kind of willing to try new things and go out of their comfort zone more often. And I think DAs would benefit from sort of like grabbing their hand and going along with things sometimes. Because I know I've been pulled into so many things that I initially was just my wounds would come up and I'd be like, no, I don't want to do that. I don't want to go to that party or I don't want to go to that trip with your friends. But then I did and I was like, that was amazing. And like it was so connecting and I felt like really good with these people. So yeah, we gotta weigh in if is this something that we're saying no to just because we're like a little bit scared, or is this something that we can actually like benefit from? So you have to weigh that out. Yeah.
Absolutely, and it's something for people listening, if you're listening in on sort of on behalf of a partner, it's really worthwhile to have that conversation with a partner about healthy compromise in a relationship. Okay, so let's
Yeah.
get to the next one here. So, too much vulnerability, intimacy, and closeness. So, let's hear that. So if you've had an experience where you felt like vulnerability was kind of demanded of you or maybe pressured or maybe there was too much like let's move too fast towards intimacy and closeness in the relationship, whether that's emotionally, like let's put a label on something, or
Yeah.
time wise, or hey, I need to hear all about your emotions and how you're feeling. And there's a pressure and vulnerability there.
Yeah.
What was your relationship to when you felt those things? And why was that so uncomfortable when you were dismissive avoidant?
Yeah. So we'll start with like if somebody's trying to move something along fast, that's the fastest way for me to sort of head the other way and not sort of create something with the person. We're talking about dating. Like if you're early in dating with someone and they're talking about like some serious stuff and wanting commitment like super soon. For me, I was always like, this is super uncomfortable. Like they don't even really know me. Probably scared that they didn't know me and they wanted to choose me, and then they'll see eventually like, "Oh, you're defective or there's something wrong with you." So I would be like, "No, like there has to be way more of like a vetting and like getting to know you process. Otherwise, this feels like this isn't right." Uh, Also, I always just felt like yeah, like, you don't know me, like, why would you wanna be with me, like, if you don't know me? Like, I would think almost like there's something off about about the person. This is before I knew about attachment style, right? Like, and anxious preoccupied and stuff like that. But I would be a little nervous, like, wow, like, if they're this intense now, like, I don't know how this is gonna be, weeks or months or years down the road.
Yeah.
So, yeah, just kinda like a turtle, you wanna move slow, and then if somebody's moving fast, you're just your
Oh, and you fell?
yeah, so, no fast movements with the DA, but I'm trying to think of the psychology behind that too, like why it was such a
Well, I think
your
there's a
response.
part where it's, like, unsafe,
Yeah,
like, the pressure that comes with it, the uncertainty with it, like, okay, if we're gonna move really fast all of a sudden, well, can I really, like, feel emotionally safe with this person? Are they gonna be like this with
yeah,
everybody? Why are they like this with me? Is there more to their story? It can feel like it's coming across a little bit for dismissive avoidance, at least as, like, desperate or they must really be lacking something, they're trying to get it through me, and it can just feel like
yeah,
uncertainty can feel unsafe, but then
mhm,
also it can feel like you said, and you said this perfectly earlier, like, a lot of dismissive avoidants feel like, "Okay, once you see me," so many DAs are scared to be seen because being
yeah,
seen is vulnerable, and being seen, if you felt the constantly in childhood, like, when you were vulnerable, nobody met your needs and it hurt, you're like, "I don't
mhm,
wanna feel vulnerable again like that, I don't wanna be in that position," so anything that's demanding of vulnerability can feel, again, it's unsafe to be seen or even like, "Oh, you're gonna see that I'm defective." And then it's just going to end in heartbreak for both of us. So why are we moving so fast? So I think there's a lot of like moving slowly as a means for dismissive avoidance to establish a sense of safety.
Yeah, exactly. And to add on, like the physical closeness, if somebody's wanting too much physical sort of touch and physical affection, that would also sort of feel like a bit of a violation almost. Like myself, I know I have sort of like a threshold where if, after there's a lot of hugging going on or a lot of kissing or a lot of intimacy, then I sort of need a bit of space to maybe like equilibrate that like closeness and vulnerability, then to sort of go back to baseline and then maybe want it again a little bit later. But if there's like too much of it and I felt like smothered or like, too much was being taken from me, I would almost, like I said, feel like a physical violation where I was like, please, like, I need a break from hugging. Like, I need a break from touching right now. And again, I also thought at the time, like, man, it must be like I must just suck or I must just be terrible in relationships. But the simple fact of the matter is, like, I feel violated if there's too much physical touch going on.
And what was the core wound, just so our listeners hear it? Like when you say violated, is it like, oh, the person's betraying me, or is it more like, oh, I feel trapped? And like,
Yeah, trapped
yeah.
for sure. Just felt trapped and just felt like engulfed and like just like a sweater that's on too tight. You're just like, oh, and then you can it feels good. These are terrible analogies, and partners of DAs are probably like, this is awful. Like my partner wants to rip me off like a sweater. But that's only after too much. Like you'll just notice after a period of time a DA might want to just have a bit of space or kind of recalibrate to get a little space back. And then they'll come back around. But they just don't need as much closeness and connection and physical contact as somebody who might be more anxious or fearful, leaning anxious.
And people who are doing the work, so people who are like aware of attachment styles and working on it and being mindful. I would have couples when I worked with a lot of couples in my practice. I would have couples come in, and if it was like a DAAP and one had a big love language around physical touch and the other was more like, whoa, I need a lot of space, it would be exposure work. The exposure work on like the AP, actually learning to have like some physical boundaries to self-soothe. They could hold space better for the DA, and the DA having to do exposure work over time to like warm up and be more, affectionately available for somebody. And it didn't have to be like
Sure.
it changes overnight, but it would be like, hey, see how touch is nice and comforting. And I think when people grow up in a household, and again, they don't get that closeness, it can just be too much. It's like overstimulating in a sense. But if, as an adult, you're in a close relationship with somebody who is touchy-feely, you see couples when they just are mindful of it over time, they end up meeting halfway, and it's good for both of them, right? It's good for the DA
Yeah.
to have more warmth and affection, and it's good for the AP to learn to also self-soothe in their own body, because a lot of like an excessive need for physical touch is coming from, I only know how to regulate my nervous system through other people. And I'm trying to get close to people because that's actually regulating me. And that's not a bad thing. That's important in terms of a co-regulation perspective. But if it's mutually exclusive and you only really know how to do that through people, then you're having to overly depend on other people as a means of regulation, and you're losing out on the ability to self-soothe. So it's actually good for both partners to come halfway and have that middle ground.
Yeah.
But it's something that often they both have to work on.
Yeah, for sure. One last thing I want to mention, it's kind of funny, but like there was times too where like a partner might start, cuddling up or might want to kiss or whatever. And automatically my mind would go to, oh, they want to have like physical intimacy, like they want to have sex. But I was probably tired from work and like was not in the mood for that whatsoever. But my mind right away is like that's their end goal. So, I better like stop this in its tracks right now and just be like, oh no, no, get away. But then what I learned after is like, no, sometimes partners just want to hold hands, just want to hug, just want to have a little small kiss session. Like it doesn't have to be like, oh, this has to go all the way every single time. And it was just interesting to learn that because, like I said, I think I, pushed a lot of people away because I was like, they just wanted a little bit of touch and cuddling. But I shut them down because I was like, I know I'm not in the mood right now. I'm super tired. Like, please get away
So
from me.
interesting. So you always thought it's like an all or nothing kind of experience.
100%. And I
So
often
interesting.
wonder if other GAs sometimes feel that way, where they're like, oh, shoot, here we go. Like, my partner is starting to come close.
Meanwhile, it's like an anxious attachment style, like, they just
Yeah.
want affection most of the time more than anything. That's so interesting. Fearful avoidants too are much more like that than anxious attachment styles, but anxious attachment styles, they can just, like they can literally just wanna be touchy-feely and kissy and huggy and without even thinking about sex or intimacy, so that's just so interesting.
Yeah.
That I wonder how many dismissive avoidants relate to that. Let us know in the comments if you are a DA.
Yeah, no, I really wonder as well because I know that, and sometimes then you can like say something and be like, "Hey, like I'm not in the mood for intimacy tonight, but can we just just hug or cuddle or kiss?"
Yeah.
Like, and your partner can say that as well. Like maybe they're not in the mood for that, but they could just let their partner if they notice that they're like warming up to their partner's like really kind of pushing them away, rejecting them. You maybe it might be worth just to say, "Hey, like just looking to have a bit of a cuddle and a kiss. Like we don't have to do anything crazy tonight."
Yeah.
So
It's so worth it to have, and those are, like, honestly, I think in long-term committed relationships, those are the conversations you wanna be able to normalize. Like, ideally,
yeah,
conversations are things that are like, hey, second nature, whether it's around sex and intimacy or affection or what anything, but just being able to, like, openly talk about those things and make that, like, a natural part of the relationship is, like, just makes everything so much easier.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, so I love that. That was a really interesting piece.
yeah.
Um
And the funny thing is, one last thing that the funny thing is, on the times where then I did learn like about the communication, and my partner did learn that if they just wanted that, they would just kind of say that. Then sometimes that would just lead to full blown intimacy anyway. But it's still good that they like asked, and like yeah, I felt like I had more control and I didn't have to like shut them down
Where there
completely.
wasn't, like, an expectation in a sense, and so
There you go.
that
That's
was
the word. The expectation piece was the hugest part because right away, just I think fight or flight would have be like, oh,
yeah.
expectation. Don't have the energy right now. But of course, I have the energy is just for a little cuddle, like if that's just what they were looking for. So
That's so funny, and it's so funny how many, like, dismissive avoidants are just so, like, the expectation of anything can cause them to kind of recoil, so it's
yeah,
interesting. Of course, that's gonna show up around intimacy too. That makes so much sense.
sure, yeah,
Okay, so let's do the last one here, and we'll do a version for FAs and APs in the future too. But I think this is probably one of the most important ones, which is I'm kind of gonna put two together, but um, conflict and criticism.
mhm,
Okay, so obviously, like they can be two separate things. Conflict will often trigger I am unsafe core wounds, I am
yeah,
misunderstood, I am helpless. Criticism will be more like I am defective, you're shaming me at my core. But most oftentimes, those things are going hand in hand. So I'm curious what your experience was like there.
yeah. The note I wrote for that under conflict was, your partner is bringing a gun to a knife fight. So the
Yeah.
DA only has a small weapon, and then the partner has a gun. So of course, the analogy is usually the partner is a little more uh, adept at like conflict, and like they weren't so scared of it, so they would just like say what they have to say. They might be get really emotional, they might get really crying or yelling or whatever. And the DA, when the like as soon as the emotions start rising, they sort of want to get away from the situation. It feels very like unsafe, and basically emotions are going to start to come up in them, and the DAs, instead of focusing more on what's happening in the moment, they're just trying to stay safe because they're like, this doesn't feel good. These emotions are overwhelming. I need to like either get out of here or like figure out a way to like push these back down. So it's like really conflict is like, I always felt like I was at a disadvantage and didn't get to really express what I wanted to express in the moment. After maybe when I was a little more calm and felt safe, then I could maybe, write a text, or, if they left, write a text or an email if you're, um, yeah, like basically it was easier to communicate after, but in the moment, conflict just seemed really overwhelming and I would just shut down.
And I
So,
think too, to add to that, like if somebody's dismissive avoidant, they don't have as much practice figuring out how to decode their feelings on a moment to moment basis because
yeah.
so much of how they cope just like to repress their feelings and to stuff them down. So now you're asking somebody who's it's almost like a different language to them to decode their feelings. And now somebody's coming at them, sometimes a little bit heated. And now you have to speak in a different language, essentially, in real time while you have this I am unsafe core wound triggered. And it's often like it's part of why dismissive avoidants need more time to process after a conflict and need time to actually create that space and then come back after reflecting on it and be able to revisit it. And oftentimes, dismissive avoidants do a good job if they have some time and space to revisit conflict. But it really, I think for a lot of dismissive avoidance, and I know this from having so many conversations with DAs over the years, is like it really feels to them like speaking a different language. Like, okay, you're gonna come at me, you're speaking really fast, you're heated, you're speaking really fast in a language I barely know, and you're expecting me to speak back as quickly with all the right answers in real time while I'm feeling already really unsafe. And it's like that's for somebody that's in that position until somebody's doing the work to actually listen to their feelings, get back in touch with their emotions and their needs, and actually develop some emotional literacy. It's asking somebody to do something that oftentimes just simply isn't quite possible in real time for them.
Yeah, that's such a great way of putting it. And yeah, it's like triggering unsafety wounds and like feeling not good enough in the relationship. You're feeling defective. You're feeling like, I don't know what I'm doing again. Like there's a lot of shame there as well, usually.
Yeah.
Because, in past conflicts that I've had, it's, the partner usually telling me like things that I'm doing wrong or what I'm, not doing right. So like shame would sort of come up. And then as soon as that, like, you feel that shame, you just kind of want to like,
Um,
yeah,
Totally.
you
Shame, like,
feel,
always think about, like, for anybody on the outside listening in who doesn't have, like, core wounds of shame, one of the cousins of shame is embarrassment, and, like, when you do something embarrassing, you're like, "I need
yeah,
to run and hide from the room, like, get me out of here," if it's, like, embarrassing in front of people or, like, I think too, this one time that I was just starting in ninth grade in high school, and it was, like, one of the first days of, like, lunch, and you're trying to, like, make new friends, and I remember I had this, like, thing that I was carrying, and it just, like, spilled everywhere, and it was, like, in front of everybody, and it was, like, right at the entrance, and I just remember this overwhelming feeling of, like, wanting to just run out of the room, and, like, obviously,
yeah,
I figured it out, but it's like you can think of, like, just embarrassment. It's not even shame. Shame for people listening too is, like, if you have a big defective core wound or unworthiness core wound or I am bad core wound, like, these wounds make you feel like if somebody's criticizing you in an argument that they're not criticizing your behaviors, they're criticizing your character, your personality, like, who you are at your core. And so sometimes too, a partner of a DA won't realize that, or a loved one of a DA won't realize that you might be saying, "Hey, like, you don't call often enough," and, like, "I'm not okay with that." And to them, they're talking about the behavior of not calling and that it's hurting them, and
mhm,
they're not realizing that maybe they're negatively framing and it's being received poorly as a result. But to the dismissive avoidant, it's not about the behavior of not calling. To the dismissive avoidant, it's about like, "Oh, you think I can't do relationships and you've seen that now I'm dysfunctional and I'm, like, fundamentally broken or flawed." And that's
yeah.
how criticism is often received in an argument. And so to your point, just to add the cherry on top in a conflict, there's often this happening, and you can see why it's, like, a lot for somebody on the other side.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty hurtful. And like you said, you're just thinking they're having a go at you as your fundamental core. Why can't you
Yeah.
keep the place clean? What's wrong with you? Whenever I hear like what's wrong with you, like right away I'm shutting down and just being like, oh, like this person sees that that I suck. So you really got to be careful with the way you go about, asking for something. Uh, you got, and it might not work the first time, but you have to sort of gently do it each time. Otherwise, yeah, if the DA sort of thinks that their core is being attacked, then they'll just shut down 100%.
Definitely. And and I think, like, for somebody listening, this isn't a battle cry for, like, walk on eggshells in a conflict if you're dating somebody dismissive avoidant, like,
Yeah.
I think it's like, hey, understand the inside world of somebody so you don't personalize their behavior so much, and then you have to bet. Like, obviously, if you're dating somebody and they are at this time not doing the work or not able to even work through a conflict in a relationship, for some people that might be a non-negotiable, right? So you have to decide that. But a lot of times it's like, can we improve our communication and
Right.
make communication an easier thing and a healthier thing where we don't do it from a place of negative framing or when we're triggered, but we actually just communicate needs in real time and we encourage compromise and negotiation in a relationship. And through doing that, both people can feel seen and heard and understood, and both people can actually feel like, oh, there's breakthroughs in this and we can get to the other side of whatever the potential problem is. And a lot of times I would see in working with clients, like if a dismissive avoidant was communicated to healthily, if it was positively framed, if the
Mhm.
person shared what they were experiencing and why it mattered to them, and then said, "Hey, let's negotiate about it. Let's hash it out. Where do you stand? What's going to be our middle ground?" There would be tremendous productivity in communication. Now, my sample size was biased because I had people coming in who were willing to do the work. They were there. They showed up to pay for counseling and make sure that they could actually have that support. And of course, that's not going to be everybody, but the vast majority of people I think might surprise you if you're able to really get that communication down pat in a healthy way. You might be surprised at how much people can really show up to do that, even if you're sort of leading the way during that process.
Exactly. And two last quick things. Number one, let someone know if they're sort of the way that they're doing conflict or the way they're sort of coming at you. If it doesn't feel good, and it's let them know how you feel. Like when you say this XYZ, it makes me feel like I'm terrible and I'm a bad boyfriend and that I just suck. So, and
Yeah.
then, next time, like, I think it would have a better result if next time you said something like XYZ, like give them sort of suggestions because sometimes they don't know. That's probably the way they grew up and how their parents probably kind of scolded them and made them feel. So they're just kind of going on autopilot. But when you sort of like jar someone into like, hey, like, this is how this makes me feel, like, you're gonna be like, "Oh, whoa, like, that's not I didn't want you to feel that way, like, I was just kinda really upset because 'cause you're not, leaving the bathroom a mess every time you go to the bathroom." So it's sort of up to you to also don't just shut down and, like, run away from the partner, like, let them know, like, "Hey, like, I'm happy to try to get better at what you're asking, but the way that you're coming at it is, like, totally just gonna make me not do it and, like, makes me feel really bad about myself." So you also wanna let your partner know if they're sort of communicating in a way that's, like, making you feel bad.
So powerful. I think that's such an important point. And because a lot of times, really, the person on the other end doesn't know, right? They really don't realize because to them, it's just words and they don't realize how that's really hitting these deep wounds for a dismissive avoidant. And I used to say to people in practice who had a partner who was a dismissive avoidant, I used to say, like, hey, do a couple things. If you're communicating a need, do it in real time. Do it through positive framing. Say, like, hey, I'm needing more of ABC rather than, hey, you never do ABC or XYZ. And so communicate in real time, but tell the person because it bypasses the dismissive avoidant core wound. Tell them, I've never shared this with you before. You're not supposed to know because it normalizes. It's not like, oh, I need ABC. And then the person goes, oh, I see. I am not good at relationships. I'm fundamentally flawed. No, like we're not supposed to be mind readers in relationships. We're
Yeah.
supposed to be able to bridge that gap. And so by normalizing, number one, hey, we should be communicating needs in a relationship. And number two, if I communicate a need, it doesn't mean you're a bad partner. You're doing it wrong. It means that like, hey, you're not supposed to read my mind. So let's just make it okay to share those things with each other. And if you're somebody who's dating a dismissive avoidant, doing that ahead of time and having that conversation and then making sure that you're mindful about how you communicate in real time, which is good for you because then you're actually the person who's being, you're tailoring your communication. You're learning to communicate the way a secure person would because that's what secure people naturally do because they saw this model to them. They communicate about their needs in real time. They frame it positively and they're regulated when they say it and they normalize the openness of communication. So by doing that, you're going to see there's so much more space for momentum to build, both from your end and from the other person's end as well.
Yeah, great. And last thing I'll say is, DAs, you sort of need to not sweep things under the carpet. So as we're talking about, like, avoidance of conflict is not gonna sort of
Dodge a conflict.
Uh, it'll never solve the conflict, and as uncomfortable as it is, and, like, I used to never wanna, like, really sit down and discuss, like, serious issues that were, like, looming over the relationship. Until you sort of start to do that and start to get good at that, like, those things just don't go away, and the beautiful thing is, once you do have one of those conversations, it just brings you guys, like, so much closer together. Like, it doesn't have to be perfect, it might be messy and might not be great, but that's the whole point of it. Like, you gotta practice sort of speaking your mind and letting the other person know how you feel, letting the other person know how they might have made you feel. Like, don't just sweep things under the carpet because yeah, they never go away.
And to your point, it gets easier with time. Eventually, you do conflict. It's a little messy at first sometimes. You're figuring it out. And then eventually it's normal. You just know how to talk through things pretty easily. So yeah, I love that. Those are such important points for the DA for sure.
Mhm.
And yeah, so that's gonna be it for the episode for today. This is a great episode. Thank you so much, Mike. If you guys want to learn more about Mike, you can down below. If you want to jump into the personal development school and learn a lot more about these things in detail with guidance, with support and on an ongoing basis, you can take our free opportunity to join down below for a limited time. And I'm really excited to everybody who listened, who stopped by. Thank you for listening. You can check us out on Apple, iTunes, or Spotify, wherever you listen to your podcasts. Or if you are listening on podcasts, you can check us out on YouTube for the full video version as well. Thank you for stopping by and for listening, and we hope to see you soon.
See you next time.
If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast platform. Share it with friends and family who are on their journey of personal development and growth, and thank you for listening. Next week, we'll be back with more insights to guide you on your journey. And until then, keep practicing our tools and strategies to change your subconscious mind and apply some of the powerful learnings from this podcast so that you experience real life transformation.